So if we think about why do people with aphasia have the difficulty that they do, um, one of the ways we can think about it is, has language been lost, or is all the language that this person learned, is it there but they have poor access to it? In other words, if we think about, again, a person having a mental dictionary, have the entries in the dictionary been erased or degraded so that they're not readable anymore? Or is the person having difficulty in the course of finding a word going to the right page where the word is? And there is I think in general, a feeling that people with aphasia have more of an access issue or an ability to activate the words that they do have. And some of the kind of common and simple signs that we see that are consistent with this is that people with aphasia, their performance is variable. In other words, if I was to give a person with aphasia 20 pictured objects to name, one day they may only get 5 of them right, and the next day they would get 7 or 8 right. And so that's an example of some inconsistencies, or the fact that oftentimes patients are very, very sensitive to cueing. In other words, when looking at these pictures, they can't say ship, but when I give them the first sound of the word, shh, boom, it comes out easily. So if it was lost or truly degraded, that wouldn't occur. Now, some patients with severe aphasia are not very cueable, and so is language lost? I don't think we really know. I think what we know is that, for example, in other conditions like dementia, you start to see really consistent loss of specific items in language, and this loss may be not just loss of the word, but loss of even knowing what the object is for. So some authors have taken this observation of variability in language performance and said that, well, one of the things underlying an aphasia is something like resource allocation. In other words, if we think about our brain as having X amount of mental resources, well, of course, then any damage to the brain is going to reduce the amount of mental resources that we have available to us. And so part of that variability might be that people with aphasia just don't have enough mental resources always to activate a lexical item, or perhaps whatever that mechanism is that allocates the correct amount of mental resources towards a task is damaged. And the discussion of attention impairments in people with aphasia is related to this thinking about resource allocation. I think most people who work with aphasia kind of acknowledge that there is both a specific problem accessing language representations and some difficulty with this resource allocation. If we think about the words in our mental dictionary, and if we think about all of the words that we know resting at the bottom of the ocean, and let's say I see a picture of a baseball, right? As soon as I see that picture, that word gets activated, and it starts to float up above the surface of the ocean. And when it gets above the surface of the water, it's in consciousness, and I've found the word. When we have a tip of the tongue phenomenon, I think what's happening is that the word that we're looking for is activated, but it's just not quite above the surface of the water. And so it's partially activated, and we can almost taste it, right? And sometimes we can say something about that word, like the first sound, what it rhymes with, whether it's short or long. And besides the fact that people with aphasia respond to cueing, which I think is an example of that a word has been partially activated but not fully activated. And sometimes when people respond so quickly to cueing and so effortlessly, that even kind of makes one believe that even more. But I've had patients who had fairly significant difficulty, let's say, naming some pictured objects, word finding in general. But if I create a little task where I've got objects to name that are made up of short words and objects that are made up of long words like watermelon, and a person is not able to name an item, and I simply ask them, is it a short word or it's a long word? You'll have patients who are very reliably will be accurate in telling you whether it's a short word or a long word. Similarly, we could ask them if it rhymes with a certain word, and oftentimes they're fairly accurate at that. And again, there's an example that the word has perhaps been, if not partially activated, at least it's certainly there.